day 11 or day 13 of Vlogmas. Again, it kind of just depends on what my schedule ends up being. So today we're going to go over some of the basics of bourbon. I know you can probably find much more well-produced videos on YouTube about bourbon, but let's go from somebody who's been doing a lot of distillery tours. So a lot of this information is things I have picked up over the couple of months I've been doing distillery tours. Also from Bluegrass Distilling, they gave us a handy dandy little, a lot of sheets about bourbon that goes over some of the different terms, and we can go over more of it in other videos that I will be making, probably about bourbon. Also, because I can't help but do stuff with my hands while working, we're gonna be doing my makeup too. First things first, bourbon is a uniquely American spirit. Bourbon, for example, has to be actually made in the United States. That's one of the legal requirements for it. It has been considered a protected spirit by European, what is the term? It is European Distillers and Vignettes. I believe that's the correct pronunciation. They have specified that for a spirit, a whiskey, to be considered bourbon, it must come from the United States. I know a lot of us think it will probably have to be from Kentucky, but that is incorrect. It just happens to be that about 95% of all bourbon is produced here in Kentucky. It's to the point where there are more barrels of bourbon than there are people in Kentucky. That is kind of one of those first things that leads it to be an American spirit. The other thing that really leans bourbon to being an American spirit and uniquely American is it has to legally be at least 51% corn to be considered a bourbon. That's where you get kind of one of those terms where bourbon is a whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. That is one of those reasons, is because bourbon has to be 51% corn, and corn is an American product. You can have different types of corn. You can have yellow corn, you can have white corn, you can have blue corn. That is one of those things where actually Bluegrass Distilling, which is the distillery that gave me some of the sheets specifically, they have a bluegrass. Buffalo Trace has been experimenting with different heritage corns. Those I don't think are on the market at all, but that is something that's going on. The next and the other really iconic thing with bourbon is it must be in a new charred oak container. Usually this means a new charred white oak barrel, because the barrel is the easiest kind of container to have. And white oak is used because things like red oak is hard to actually use for barrels. Also, you can still experiment because white oak from different parts of the United States will have different flavors with it. And the charring actually brings out different flavors. So oftentimes when you've had bourbon, there may be a strong vanilla to it once you get past the initial alcohol burn. And with that, that vanilla flavor that you get from bourbon is just from the barrel, because the charring brings out the vanillin, and as the barrel expands and contracts, the liquid in the barrel expands and contracts with the seasons, it picks up some of those chemical compounds like vanillin. Also with the charring, that's what provides that dark color, because one of the other things with bourbon is you cannot add any colors or flavorings. All of it must come from the grains, the yeast that's used, and the barrel. Because yes, also bourbon, in the making of any sort of whiskey, you've got a couple of different grains and you've got yeast, which the yeast is used to produce alcohol. But yes, you can't have any extra flavors. So Fireball, for example, is not a bourbon, could never be, because you have that cinnamon flavor involved. Although, funny fact, overall company that produces Buffalo Trace. So Buffalo Trace is owned by the Sazerac family. Now it also owns Fireball. So yeah, fun little factoid there. The next thing, and kind of the last, and this one's a little bit more technical with some of the legal basics, is with bourbon, when it gets off the still, it can be no more than 160 proof. And when it goes into the barrel, you have to actually proof it down, so you have to actually add water to it, and that would reduce it to about 125. It can be no more than 125. Some places, for example, like to do 110, like Wilderness not Wilderness, Woodford Reserve does 110, for example, or in the case of places like Lux Row, do 124.9 to go into the barrel. It all is very dependent. So those are kind of the 5 basic legal classifications. There's a lot more with bourbon. So like I mentioned a little bit, you've got the 51% corn. The others can be a couple of combinations of different things. There's usually going to be rye, especially in modern bourbons. Rye is usually the second most common grain. And then the third will be a malted barley or a malted grain. Usually it's malted barley. However, I've heard of distilleries, specifically the Chattanooga whiskey experience, using other malted grains to kind of experiment around. And all of those provide different flavors that can be imparted on the bourbon. The other thing is the yeast that's used. Some distilleries only use 1 strain of yeast. I believe Buffalo Trace maybe only uses 2 or 3, depending on what the mash bill is, while you've got places like Four Roses that uses 10. Also, like I just said, mash bill, that is actually the combination of the different grains that you are using. A mash bill for some distillery could be 70% corn, 25% rye, and 5% malted barley. That is usually one way of doing it. And also with the making the mash, you have 2 different types of mash bills. You can have either a sour mash or a sweet mash. A sweet mash means you just made the original batch of it and you used all of it up. Sour mash instead takes some of the grains and fluids from a previous distillation, or really a previous cook, and put it back in. So similar to sourdough, where you keep a little bit of that mother bread and you keep on passing it down. That's what a sour mash is. And most distilleries use a sour mash as a way to kind of keep the same flavor combination. So theoretically, for example, if you're having something from Buffalo Trace, you may be having much older distillations that they have done. With bourbon, there's a lot of different terms. You also do have to think about things like how long the barrels are aging for. Legally, especially to be considered a Kentucky bourbon, it has to be aged for at least a year. And then to be considered a straight bourbon, it has to be between 2 to 4 typically, and you have to label if it's under 4 years specifically. And usually afterwards, you still want to kind of say like, oh yeah, especially post 10, you're like, yeah, it's 10. I will also point out that that age that you see on there is the youngest barrel that is being used. Because usually what happens with distilleries is they will combine different barrels together to get a more well-rounded flavor. Because in the different locations they're in the rick house, which is where you hold the barrels, you can get different flavor profiles, because a barrel that's at the bottom of the rick house is going to have a very different temperature fluctuation than the barrel at the top of the rick house. You're going to get usually a sweeter flavor at the bottom than at the top. There is another kind of classification you may see on certain bottles called bottled and bonded. This is actually the first ever Consumer Protection Act in the United States that was brought up by a class action lawsuit by a couple of distillers here in the United States. Prior to this act, you could not bottle your own bourbon, except like maybe 1 or 2 companies could do that. In this case, it came out in 1897. It means that you have 1 distillation season, 1 distiller, and at 1 distillery. And you have to age it for at least 4 years, and it goes in the bottle at 100 proof. And it is in a federally bonded warehouse. And so you bottle your own bourbon also in this case. And you have to be also then given this thing called the DSP, which is a distilled spirit number plant. So for example, Heaven Hill is DSP KY1. Four Roses is DSP KY20, and James E. Pepper, even though the original has gone out of business, the new one, because it's a heritage, is DSP KY4, especially since it's at its original location still. When it comes to bourbon, you can have a lot of different flavors. Got this whole flavor wheel. It's a lot. And you've kind of got 5 main characteristics with it: sweet, tree, spice, grain, and botanical. For the most part, I think of things with like The sweet will usually give you more of a rich flavor. Some of the big ones that you'll see are like caramel and butterscotch. That one, especially that butterscotch, is really common to have in things like Woodford Reserve's double oak. Other ones you'll see a lot is in the spice category, especially on bourbons that have a higher rye concentration. Rye is a very spicy grain that will lean on more on a peppery, especially on the pepper kind of side. But you also may get a little bit of leather. That's from the tannins, which again are found in the oak barrels. There are sometimes also on the sweet, I forgot to mention, you get the aromatics from like the vanilla. Vanillin is a really big one to develop in the barrels, especially when churring. They sometimes also do things that's called a toasting. That toasting will be a longer like heating where you don't develop a full char. Also with the charring, I forgot to mention that there's an industry standard called, and it's different levels. Most of the time they do like a level 3, which will only be for about 50 seconds to burn. So, I know a lot of this stuff and I tried to make notes, but it sometimes just kind of flows out. I also had forgotten to mention with the barrels and with not being able to add other flavorings in, there is one workaround actually on how to get the extra flavors. And I kind of mentioned it when I mentioned the double oak having that sweetness. So in the case of double oak at Woodford Reserve, for example, they have the barrels in maturing to a certain point, to a certain flavor profile. They take it out of that barrel and then they finish it off for another 6 months, I believe is how long it stays in there, in a different barrel that has been toasted for about 45 minutes at like a lower temperature. So actually that's been pretty common now, is to have like finish off a barrel in a different type of barrel. Like it has to be originally matured in a new charred oak barrel, but it does not need to stay in said charred oak barrel after the fact. You can put it in something else for barreling later on. Lux Row, for example, had bourbon that had been finished off in a Cabernet. Or in the case of Bardstown, they finished off some of their barrels in rum barrels instead. Another example, again, this is just Bluegrass Distilling. They finish off their barrels. They then put some maple syrup. So the maple syrup develops some of that bourbon flavor. And then after the maple syrup has gotten their flavor, they then send it back so you can finish off more bourbon in that barrel that has gotten some of that maple syrup. So that is a way to kind of get around, impart flavor from the barrel without officially adding. We're in currently a second wave of a bourbon boom. There's, for example, in Kentucky, a lot of craft distilleries. These craft distilleries also, they make less than, I forgot how many barrels they make a year, but it's on the lower side. Craft distilling also usually has other spirits, like either a vodka or a gin, because those white spirits do not require extra aging. You can just take it immediately off of the still. Bourbon also, I don't know if this is legally required, but usually you will have at least a double still. That is what I have seen. I've seen at least 2 distillations for each bourbon you will have. So some of the terms you may also see with bourbon is either small batch, which there's no full yes, this is exactly what that means. Usually on the larger scale, it's 200 to 300, but for say a craft where you're only making maybe 5,000 barrels total, it may be only 10 to 20. That way you can kind of get a focus on a specific flavor or play into that. And then you've also got things like single barrel, which is really popular. One of the original single barrels was Blanton's, again by Buffalo Trace. This was based off of Albert Blanton, who would pick specific barrels to give out to friends and family. That is a really common one because you can get such unique flavors with it. It's really exciting actually sometimes when you find a really good single barrel. Again, also with a single barrel, it means once it's gone, it is gone for good. But that also has been a common thing now with bourbon, is to have kind of these rare finds. With bourbon, there are a couple ways of tasting it. If you're in a sampling, one of the best ways of doing it is doing the 3-sip method and what is referred to as the Kentucky Chew. In this case, you take an initial sip. That will be the one to kind of acclimate your tongue to having the alcohol, the burn of the alcohol. You're not going to get much, but you want to swish it around your mouth to kind of open up your palate a bit more. Then you wait a little bit, about 20 seconds, and then you do another sip, and then again kind of have it move around. You can get a little bit more of the flavor. Hopefully it's not as burning alcohol. And then the third sip is where you really start to get a feeling for what the flavors are. Another trick to do is to add a drop or two of water, because the water will actually open up the flavors a bit more and you can get kind of a better idea. There's actually a chemical reaction going on that I am not super familiar with or how to describe it exactly, but I like to do that when I go on tastings, is getting like a little dropper of water and just putting a little bit in. You can see kind of things open up a bit more actually with that bourbon. I do not recommend doing that with rye usually, because that brings the smokiness much more forward on the in the bourbon, in the whiskey, not the bourbon. A rye is not bourbon, it is a whiskey. Again, rye is similar in the fact that it has to be at least 51% rye. Most of the time in the United States, you will see things that are sometimes 100% rye or like 95% rye with a little bit of malted, and usually it's just very spicy. Sometimes it's not, but like sometimes, like a lot of times it is. I stay very careful with high rye concentrated things, or if they really play into that rye spice. But that's one way of doing the tastings. I do highly recommend adding water. That's also a big reason why with bourbon, you'll have it on the rocks. So you get the ice as it slowly melts, it opens up that bourbon. And bourbon is honestly a good one to just slip on the rocks. I have done that with Buffalo Trace, and it is delicious. Other ways of having bourbon are things like an old fashioned, which is a cocktail that is either simple syrup or like having sugar with some water mixed in it, Angostura bitters or whatever bitters you desire, and the bourbon with either a lemon or orange twist. Typically you'll see it with an orange twist, but the original recipe is with actually a lemon. I myself think I like it more with a lemon twist, but if you do orange bitters with the orange twist, it is delicious. You will also sometimes see with bourbons the cask strength or barrel proof, which means you will then have usually how long you have it in the barrel, it will increase in its proof because the water has evaporated during the aging process. But no, things will evaporate, so instead of going in at 125 proof, it may come out at 140. And legally, it only has to be lower than 160 proof to be sold, but usually, so you can get any combination. Sometimes you'll get like 110 proof for a cask strength. And I will say, like, one of my favorites is from a place called Town Branch. They have this thing called True Cask, which is about 50 barrels of their normal and then 50 barrels of a proprietary mash bill. Mix them together, and I believe it stays at whatever cask strength is. Oh, it's so good. It is a really good bottle. Other things you may hear, like I mentioned, you'll see rye a lot. A lot of distilleries will have both a bourbon and a rye because it's almost the same process, and usually they end up using a similar mash bill, except they just swap out how much corn and how much rye is being used. Also in the rick houses, this is where you get the terms of the angel share and the devil cut. The devil cut is what is lost to the barrel. So when you look actually at a barrel, you will see a line where that was how deep the water got in. And that's the devil's cut, and the angel share is the smell that comes from it. This is originally from winemaking, is where that term originally comes from, but it's used all over in any sort of distillation process. So that is some of the facts with bourbon. I know this was a little bit all over the place. I tried to be a little bit more controlled in how I was explaining things, but that was some of the big things. I also just am now looking at one of my pieces of information I forgot to mention. As I said, most mash bills are typically corn, rye, and malted barley. And that is usually what you'll see, especially post-prohibition style. Pre-prohibition, you may see more of a wheated, and you'll actually see that commented on the like bourbons. Usually is they will say it's a wheated bourbon instead of a normal bourbon. A wheated bourbon uses wheat instead of rye. So things like Weller's and Pappy Van Winkle, which are two of the most expensive bourbons on the market, especially Pappy's, it's like $90 a pour. It's obscene. It's also that case, it uses wheat instead of rye, and it is one of my favorites. It leans on the sweeter side. The other thing is, like how I mentioned with Pappy's being expensive and it being 23 years, that is actually in part, of course, due to like scarcity, but because of how much taxes are applied on the barrels. So the distillers are taxed each year by both the federal government and Kentucky for how much like bourbon they have. And that is based off of how much goes into the initial barrel. So each barrel is about 52 gallons. Well, after 23 years, you don't have 52 gallons of bourbon anymore. You have maybe 10. It fills very few bottles, actually, because of how many times there have been the cycles of evaporating and shrinking in the barrel. So you may end up with very little, but you've been taxed for 20 years on this liquor. So then you have to catch it up somewhere. So that is actually a large amount of these costs is due to the taxation on each of these barrels. I'm just gonna finish up my little bit of makeup. I don't actually have mascara in here. I have it left someplace else. Whoops. I mean, y'all can't see it anyway, so what does that matter? I have found that it's a fun thing to learn about, and I do not have as refined of a palette as some, but it's a fun exploration, honestly. So I hope my rambly explanation on some of the basics of bourbon have been very helpful, and I hope y'all explore more of Kentucky bourbon because it's delicious and it is a great way about learning about Kentucky because each county pretty much has a distillery. Although humorously, Bourbon County only has one. I'm assuming it's because of some prohibition laws, because Kentucky and Tennessee were both hit very early on with prohibition laws, and there are a lot of dry counties in this area. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and enjoy a bourbon on me. And I shall see you guys later. Bye!